right, I think we're going to get started. I think there'll be people, particularly attendees, trickling in, and I'll give everybody a little bit of orientation about how we're running tonight's session. But welcome everybody and good day, evening here in the U.S. and morning in Japan. This is, the continuation of what is now, I think, 2 years of what we call the Keio Cyber Civilization Research Center and Columbia School of International and Public Affairs cyber dialogue, which, we've moved into. This is the third sort of big panel session that Columbia has hosted. The dialogue was established, like I say, a couple years ago, and its purpose is really to have a continuing discussion between, people with a policy focus, people with a business focus, people with academic research projects in focus, to talk about the challenges and opportunities related to cybersecurity, with a real focus on collaboration between the U.S. and Japan in this area. We've moved very much to a rhythm of the dialogue where each school, Keio and Columbia, host a major session. The Keio sessions are in the fall related to their annual cybersecurity conference, and the Columbia focused sessions are part of what we call the Niejelow Rodin digital and cyber program. And for a long time, Janow, who will be our first speaker and the former dean at SIPA, sponsored a program, and there was the major conference where we had everybody in person. But as the dialogue has existed only in these times since the spring of 2020, we've moved that Niejelow Rodin forum to this online panel forum. And again, this is the third of a series of these events. And one thing I do want to do at the start is thank the Niejelow Rodin Foundation for their support of this dialogue and other elements of the SIPA program. The approach is tonight a panel where we're going to have 4 distinguished speakers, which I'll introduce sort of in succession as we go through it, talking about sort of the challenges, but also how to meet those challenges in terms of digital trade as an opportunity, and the rising focus on national approaches to privacy and data nationalization. And we're going to get a lot of different perspectives on how this major element of our societal transformations into a digital age will be affected by this phenomena. The format is also one we've used now a number of times, where the ongoing participants in the dialogue will be in what we call a panelist room. We'll run it pretty much like we normally do, where a speaker will speak and then the dialogue members will pose questions, and we'll go have a discussion of the perspective that the speaker brought to us. But additionally, in these larger sessions, we've opened it up to students and others who'd like to attend, and they will be in a broader attendee space, not directly interacting with the speakers, but able to basically be able to see the dialogue and learn from it. This is also probably a good moment to note the way we've always handled it, and we'll again tonight, is that the speakers will be recorded during their remarks, and those recorded remarks will be available, as all of the work of the dialogue is available, in sort of video form. But when we move to the discussion, we'll use Chatham House rules, and therefore, while you can acknowledge the thinking that occurs in the dialogue, we are not going to name specific speakers and organizations related to those thoughts. Hopefully the technology will work pretty smoothly. Ask any sort of forgiveness in advance if we have any technical glitches going forward, but it seems like everything's going pretty well right now. The flow for this evening is going to be basically each of the speakers making their remarks and then time for discussion. Approximately, we've got almost 2 hours, so 20, 25 minutes per speaker, maybe a little bit longer. My job with my assistants is to try to keep track of time and keep us moving along so that all four of our speakers will get a chance to bring their perspectives to bear. So with that, I think we'll begin. And as I had mentioned earlier, Merit Janow, who has recently stepped down as the dean of the school here, but still very participant in the community, both for Columbia, but also more broadly in many activities, some of which I'm about to detail, will be our first speaker. She's an internationally recognized expert in international trade and investment, extensive experience in academia, government, and business, and with the Asia Pacific region her entire life. So Merit, I'll embarrass you a little bit and go through a few things. Okay, I'll try to keep it short. But in addition to being the dean, she's been for many years a professor at both SIPA and the Columbia Law School. I do have to mention her government service, which has been as a member of the World Trade Organization's appellate body and Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust in the U.S. Justice Department, and a very extensive resume in corporate leadership, including currently being the chairperson of the board at MasterCard. So with that, Merit, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Greg. And first of all, I want to thank everyone for, thank you in particular for your leadership of this cyber dialogue. I'm very, very happy that we have these mechanisms to be exchanging views with scholars and experts and business leaders in Japan and more broadly, and very proud of the efforts that you have led and other colleagues at Columbia to deepen our engagement around the world. I think first, let me just say I was not the head of the antitrust division. I just had the privilege of running an advisory committee to it on cross-border enforcement. You've invited me to offer some initial remarks on what's happening with globalization, economic globalization, and really what does it mean for the digital economy and digital trade. And so I'd like to mention some very broad trends and some building blocks that have been created in policy frameworks and trade agreements. But I start with an apology for the broad brush nature of these comments and recognize that we have experts with us who know every piece of this extremely well, better than I, and can weigh in. Unfortunately, after I have to leave, so I will have to listen to their remarks afterwards, but I'm very grateful. I think that in some ways we kind of passed the high watermark of attitudes in favor of globalization, especially in the developed world. We created, the Uruguay Round WTO multilateral framework in the early and mid 90s. And we've really been unable as a world to negotiate comprehensive agreements with advanced and developing countries together of a binding nature, covering goods and services and regulatory features that have cross-border effects. The most comprehensive set was those agreements in the mid 1990s. And it's also important to remember that even though it was the first set that really covered services and the world signed on to those, the country schedules mattered. And a lot of countries really didn't make very many substantive commitments with respect to services. And of course, China's one example. When it acceded, its services commitments were very limited. And I think following that period of kind of expansive multilateralism, the world has gone through a period where frameworks that have advanced around globalization have tended to do so more on a regional basis. And there was a feeling that, well, this would have positive spillovers and lead to competitive liberalization, and you could have hard rules and soft rules, and this would lead eventually to an expansion of multilateral rules. But we haven't really seen that. So what you've seen instead, I think, are more regional frameworks, hard and soft, and an increasing politicization of those frameworks, um, regional hubs, and an increasingly, I think, a politicization, and for some countries seen as a way of sort of a bulwark against a growing China, in some very much including China, of course. Um, and many economists have observed that after the great financial crisis, 2008 and 9, you really started to see a lot of souring towards globalization, and by some aggregate measures, globalization slowing. Certainly that I think attitudes towards protectionism, nationalism, what the economists just called slowbalization, funny word, it's been more true, interestingly, among the developed countries than the developing. Now, the developing have been less open as economies, but have had more positive attitudes towards expanding trade. Um, in recent times, COVID times, I think you've seen several important trends. You've obviously seen a real acceleration of the digital transformation and recognition of its positive potential for growth, for inclusion, the dynamism that it offers. And you've also seen, these supply chain disruptions and calls for greater nationalism and domestic competitiveness, the U.S.-China tensions, the tensions on decoupling, the desires by many countries to develop more resilient supply chains, to build critical technologies at home. Buy America, the CHIP Act, the European CHIP Act. You've seen this blending of economics and security. And this is not just in the US and Europe, it's also, I think, in Japan is beginning to develop these new frameworks. So if you ask me today, where are we? I think we have this multilateral framework. It's extremely important. I think it's at risk, and we should be concerned about that. I think you're seeing a fragmentation and regionalization, politicization. So far, not increased protectionism, but a lot of risks in the system. And of course, regulatory systems around data, around privacy, and around security are very much in flux and evolving within countries. And it's very difficult to create global approaches when domestic systems are in flux. And of course, given the differences in approach between major jurisdictions, including the US and Europe, not to mention, of course, the United States, Europe, and China. So what are the building blocks in the trade regime currently around the digital economy? I think there are some, and not in the trade regime. Of course, Europe has created GDPR around privacy issues, and that's actually influencing how systems are developing around the world. The so-called Brussels effect, many point to, I think that's continuing to have influence around the world. But another kind of building block, I think, is in trade agreements. And some of that speaks to how data is handled in the home jurisdiction and across borders. The major building blocks that I look at and see are the CPTPP, which Japan advanced even after the US pulled out, and in the US regional context, the USMCA. So in the USMCA, I think it goes a little bit beyond CPTPP. It covers things like electronic payment systems, services, standstill provisions on new regulatory discrimination, including financial flows, cross-border data flows, prohibiting countries, members from data localization or data storage requirements for financial services providers. It's a very helpful provision. allowing data transfer, and some, as you know, new commitments to strengthen collaboration on cybersecurity between U.S., Canada, and Mexico, although I don't know, frankly, how much has actually happened under that. But there's language and there's thinking that countries need to agree, the USMCA countries need to agree to leverage risk-based approaches, to develop consensus-based standards and risk management, to develop best practices. And very interestingly is the framework that is developing in Asia between the DIPA framework between Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile. And these aren't as binding. Countries commit to endeavor to do a variety of things. And some of those are nuts and bolts, like creating electronic trade infrastructure, digital logistics, trade facilitation measures. And some are more structural around electronic payments infrastructure, non-imposition of technical regulations, legal frameworks, again, no data localization, promoting AI governance frameworks, but these are not hard law frameworks. And most recently, I guess, the Singapore Digital Economy Agreement, which is one of the most sectoral that we've seen. And this is getting into other newer areas, I think, newer still, trying to create safe principles that would influence the safe environment around online experiencing, around digital standards, collaboration on fintech and regulatory technology. So I give these as example of the building blocks that are out there. And I think the business community, the international business community, the technology community, is also playing a role, advocating and raising the question, do we need new policy frameworks? And maybe they need to be expert frameworks, and where should they reside? Should they, and so you're seeing the ICC, for example, argue that you need a new expert forum, maybe, driven out of the G20 process, maybe a data or technology board, because the trade system, is finding points to touch these issues, but you really need expert communities. So as I look ahead, I'll just stop by saying, I'm sort of seeing a world where there are tensions, obviously, around globalization, where there are increasing tensions around these issues that have animated, our dialogues around data, privacy, security, where there are no international frameworks. Domestic frameworks are still evolving. And so I see a world of a multi-layered approaches is likely necessary and evolving with different expert communities and as well as in trade policy frameworks. I didn't mention RCEP. I should have. There are others I could mention. And I think RCEP is a very important confidence building measure. But some of the others I've mentioned have been more specific with respect to particularly data and data flow issues. So those are just some very broad brush observations of how globalization is proceeding. And, I don't think it's fair to say that globalization has stopped. I think it's probably right to say it slowed. But there are numerous dimensions you need to look at to answer, I think, what's actually happening as we come out of COVID and look to the future. Let me stop there, Greg, if that is helpful to get a conversation rolling.
We'll turn at this point to our next speaker. And again, the recording button is coming back on. I'd like to introduce Rikako Watai. Rikako is a professor of administrative law and has been teaching at Keio University since 2008. Her research focuses on regulatory policy, and she's written and spoken extensively on U.S. and Japanese regulation of foreign direct investment from a national security point of view. She's a graduate of Keio, Harvard Law School, and received her PhD from the University of Tsukuba in 2008. She's a member of the New York Bar and practiced New York law for a year at an international law firm in Tokyo before starting to teach. With that, Rikako, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rattray, for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak tonight about digital trade. As my expertise, my research is on foreign direct investment, but let me try to speak to you about digital trade tonight. When I took my sabbatical 8 years ago, I spent a wonderful year as a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School. And I haven't had a chance to go back to New York since. And I haven't been out of Japan for the past 2 years, but I hope we will be able to travel easily soon. And I hope to welcome you all to Tokyo very soon. So let me try to share my slides with you. Okay, so let me start. So I'm going to speak about the legal aspects of digital trade, and there is no clear definition of digital trade yet, but the OECD definition is well established. So digitally enabled transactions of trading goods and services that can either be digitally or physically delivered, and that involve consumers, firms, and governments. So since this is a commercial transaction involving the transfer of data and information, the handling of data is extremely important. So this survey at the bottom is by the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and it shows that the market for digital trade is expanding. So B2C, of course, means business to consumer, and this table shows that the merchandising sector and digital sector are growing fast. The reason for the drop in services sector, I assume, is the loss of travel and dining opportunities due to COVID-19, which is proportional to the growth in the other two sectors. So there are no rules in place specifically for digital trade at this time. The existing rules of WTO do not always cover the exchange of data, which is a characteristic of digital trade. So as shown in the slide, it was announced last December that the negotiations would be completed by the end of this year. However, we must note that the positions of the major countries differ with respect to digital trade rules. So I'm moving on to approaches. So in the United States, the private sector has a huge influence in making rules around data, given the presence of IT platformers like GAFA. By contrast, EU formulated General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, in 2016, taking an approach to rulemaking that focuses on individuals rather than businesses. And in China, the government takes the lead on data management. And finally, Japan has a policy of DFFT, and I'm sure Mr. Okuya will provide us with more details on the development of DFFT. So I think it's important to adjust these differences in order to facilitate digital trade and to avoid fragmentation of cyberspace. So now let's move on to data localization. First definition. According to Professor Yoshinori Abe's article, the definition is as follows. So data localization in a narrow sense means data storage and domestic facility installation requirement. So I would say the Chinese regulation is a data localization measure in a narrow sense. So next is data localization in a broader sense. It means narrow data localization and regulation for the purpose of protecting privacy and personal information. So this means EU's GDPR is a data localization in a broader sense. And what current WTO rules would apply to data localization? That's our next issue. And under the WTO agreement, the disciplines that apply depend on what the digital content is. So if digital content is viewed as a transaction of goods, then GATT applies. If digital content is viewed as a transaction of services, then GATT apply. And if digital content is viewed as a royalty for intellectual property rights, then TRIPS. So I assume the US would prefer GATT. Since the United States has a highly competitive IT industry, GATT would be preferable because it is committed to the principle of non-discrimination. And I think the EU supports the application of GATT, which allows certain reservations to be made for the protection of digital content. And I believe Japan does not think in terms of GATT or GATT, but rather that if the same content as tangible item is transmitted electronically, then either one applies. I mean, please think of CD, which is an tangible item, so GATT applies. And music streaming service, thus if the content of the CD is transferred by way of music streaming service, then GATT applies. That's the Japanese position. I assume it is so. And I do not have an answer to which rules apply, but WTO panel report, as shown here, these two reports especially note that GATTs apply to all trading services regardless of the means of delivery. So these panel reports suggest that point. So I will consider data localization in relation to GATTs today. So in any case, I think it's fair to say that the basic idea is the same, whether it is GATTs or TRIPS or the GATT. So the question is whether data localization is in conflict with GATT's obligations. So we have two basic obligations, GATT obligations, WTO obligations. Article 2 of the GATT is most favored nation treatment, MFN treatment, and it means the most favorable treatment granted to any one country shall be accorded to all other member countries. This means if a particular country is targeted for data localization, it violates the MFN obligation. So under the GDPR, countries that obtain an adequacy decision from the European Commission will not be required to take individual action to transfer personal data with the EU, which may constitute preferential treatment. And the national treatment, Article 17, means that both domestic and foreign businesses receive the same treatment. So if only foreign service providers bear the burden of data localization, it may violate national treatment. So let's see whether data localization is an acceptable exception to the GATT, general exceptions. So data localization may be justified by C2. In Professor Abe's paper mentioned earlier, he says that if data localization is overly restrictive, it does not satisfy the necessity requirement, but she says necessary to secure compliance with laws or regulations, which are not inconsistent with the provisions of this agreement, including those relating to the protection or privacy of individuals. So if the data localization does not go so far, it can be justified under this clause, but it has to satisfy the necessity requirement. And we are not sure exactly what that means. And same can be said with A, necessary to protect public morals or maintain public order. And there's another exception. Another exception is the security exception. And this article leaves a wide discretion to member countries because it says the highlighted part, to prevent any member from taking any action which it considers necessary. So it's up to the member countries, and the member countries have wide range of discretion. But as you can see, this security exceptions applicability is very much limited. This is because the justification for this exception would be a matter of emergency or military relations. And let's move on to the Japan's current situation. In Japan, the current administration, Kishida administration, has taken a major step forward in addressing economic security. So Prime Minister Kishida said in his policy speech that he will take on the enactment of a new legislation on economic security. And the bill has passed the House of Representatives, I think it was last week, and is currently being discussed in the House of Councillors. So the proposed economic security legislation has 2 points. And the first one is strategic autonomy. And it means strengthening the foundation of citizens' lives and economic activities. So simply put, strategic autonomy means protective or defense perspective, has those perspectives. So securing supply chains, stable supply, and ensuring the safety of key infrastructure are two important elements that fall under this category. And the other one is strategic indispensability. It means expanding areas in which Japan's presence is indispensable in the international community, and is simply put an active or perhaps offense perspective. The bill cites supporting the development of key technologies and introducing a secret patent system. So I think there is a room for data localization to become an issue regarding the application of this bill. So economic security is the concept of achieving national security through economic means. So therefore, this would not be a situation where the provisions of the security exception we just saw in the GATS would apply. So GATS security exceptions was in the traditional military sense. So if the distribution of data were to be restricted from the perspective of economic security, it has to be in line with the GATS, or at least has to fall in the category of general exceptions. For your reference, the security exception provisions in the TPP and the U.S. Japan digital trade agreement are more flexible when compared to GATS. So this is the U.S. Japan trade agreement security exceptions clause. And as you can see, it can be easily applied to matters that are not of security in a traditional sense. But if you start applying these exceptions too much, then it will, of course, be an obstacle to digital trade, expansion of digital trade. And finally, the way I see the situation, I think it's possible that economic security could be a constraint on digital trade. However, security is like an operating system in a computer, and only with a solid foundation, national security at the bottom, can digital trade and other economic activities as applications be conducted on top of it. Since economic security cannot be explained in terms of pure free trade or economic rationality, the challenge is how to reconcile the two. So I think there are cases where data localization is necessary from a security perspective, but of course we must remember that free trade is the prerequisite. So there's a limit to how much digital trade can be controlled by existing rules. So I look forward to seeing what kind of rules would be developed over digital trade and data localization. Okay, thank you. I'll stop here.
You know, what I'd like to do now is introduce our next speaker, Toshikazu Okuya. You know, Toshi is the director of the Cybersecurity Division at the Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry. since 2017. He's been in METI for quite a long time, since 1995. And it was stationed in the U.S. from 2010 to 2013, which is when I first had a chance to work with Toshi's, when he was a special advisor to METI at Rattray here in New York. After returning to Tokyo, he's worked on a number of very important projects, probably most significantly the Strategic Energy Plan, as well as being in charge of security export control and inward investment control as part of Japan's security programs. He studied at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. So as in many of the people in the dialogue, has very deep experience both in the U.S. and in Japan. So Toshi, over to you.
Thank you for your introduction for me. This is Toshi Okuya. Now I'm the director of the policy planning and coordination Information Policy Bureau now.
Okay.
So yeah, sorry for that. But I used to be a director of the cybersecurity division by last summer. And today, so firstly, I would like to touch upon our effort for cybersecurity. Maybe this issue is heavily related to the supply chain forming issue. And then I would like to touch upon how to promote the data-driven economy with DFFT, the concept, the data free flow with trust. The operating team will be able to show my slides, or I should show my slides by myself.
I think we can show them for you if you would prefer that. Eli, are you prepared to be able to do that?
Maybe yes.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you see? Okay. Thank you very much. So I prepared too much slides. So because of that, so I expect the operating team will share my slide with audience later.
Yes, we will do that.
Yeah.
Yep.
And firstly, so I would like to mention that not only change of the global structure, but also digitalization itself gave a big impact on supply chain forming. That's a very important point. So the firstly, so Professor Janow touched upon some kind of the complicated structure between the digital trade and the national approach for data because of some security reasons, blah, 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 blah. So firstly, we should understand we are facing a new type of risks in a cyber-physical integrated society driven by digitalization. So far, we just need to care about some kind of trustworthiness on existing people, tangible people in conventional space. For example, to build a trustful supply chain, we just choose a counterpart which has already taken the ISMS certificate like that. Such a kind of tangible signal we can use to build trustful supply chain. That's the first layer. This area is a conventional space. But digitalization will make a new space, cyberspace. And second layer is a kind of a boundary between physical space and cyberspace managed by IoT system. So we are facing a new type of risk from these new spaces. So far, we put anchor point of trustworthiness on entity, individual trustworthiness itself in conventional space. It's a first layer. But on the other hand, we also need to care about the new risk from boundary between cyberspace and physical space and cyberspace. And today's discussion is heavily related to third layer, cyberspace issue. In cyberspace, we cannot put on the anchor point of trustworthiness on individual or entities. We don't care about the data from which person. We just need data in cyberspace. But on the other hand, we need to put on the anchor point of trustworthiness on data itself in cyberspace, in third layer. What kind of risk we need to manage? We start thinking of such a kind of things. Some country, government itself should give a strong anchor, the strong trustworthiness on data itself. Because of that, they choose a strong data localization and a very strict regulation on the people or entity to manage the data like that. In some cases, it's a perfectly depend on each individual organization's the decision how to use such a kind of data. In such a case, we don't need to introduce a strict rules or a hard rule for data management like that. It means in the case of data management rule is heavily linked with each community experience or ruling styles like that. That's a very important point. And we need to understand such a kind of structure we are facing. To deal with new risk from cyber-physical integrated society, we need to share the same understanding, what kind of risk we will need to manage. Because of that, METI, we decided to introduce a cyber-physical security framework. We named CPSF in April 2019. We hope this kind of tool will be able to contribute for us to share the same understanding, what kind of risk we are facing and what kind of measures we should choose to manage such a kind of risk. And then now, in the process to make CPSF, we carefully keep the harmonization with other standards and framework like the NIST cybersecurity framework or SP 800-171 or ISO 27001 to blah, blah, blah. And actually in CPSF, there are several correspondent tables between those standards and framework and CPSF to give the correct signal for not only Japanese industries, but also all other industries outside Japan. And also we are proposing to make this concept as an international technical specification in ISO IEC now. We have very good discussion. And in Japan, we are expanding this kind of activity, not only just for the general thing, but also for specific area or specific specific purpose. Now we are operating 7 sectoral working group to make a cyber physical security guideline based on CPSF now. And also we are running a 3 task force to deal with a specific cross-border issue like IoT and data management. We have just released data management framework for collaborative data utilization in this April. So I think around 3 or 4 years ago, I talked with Gregory to how to promote the data transformation among countries. But on the other hand, as I mentioned, each country had already introduced each own data management rules. How to overcome such a kind of situation, that's a very big challenge for us. And the data is not tangible one. Because of that, it's not easy to give the appropriate protection, actually. Because of that, we need to make the data situation visualized. Because of that, we decided to introduce this framework. So firstly, we would like to visualize the data situation with 3 viewpoints: properties of data, data for domain, data for event. 3 perspectives will make a big contribution to make data visualized like this. What kind of risk we will have if we move data from A to B? And what kind of risk we will have to data if we give some kind of editing activity to data? To use this framework, we will be able to clarify what kind of risk we will have when we use data or when we treat some kind of treatment on data. It means we will be able to use this framework as a tool to make analysis on data rule gaps between countries. We will be able to make this kind of map based on Japanese rule management rules. Of course, we will be able to make the data situation, the data situations map based on U.S. rule management related rules. We will be able to compare between Japan's chat case and U.S. chat case. If we will be able to clarify the gaps between 2 countries' systems, we will be able to introduce some kind of bridge treatment. So we would like to make such a kind of activity. And that's one of the ideas to realize data free flow with trust. We have just released an interim report for DFFT from METI in this April also, in this February. And in this expert group discussion, we heard a lot of problems from industries. What kind of difficulties they faced when they try to move data from A country to B country. And in some cases, a company gave up to operate their services in specific country because data protection or data localization requirement like that. That's a reality. But on the other hand, we would like to overcome such a kind of problem to promote global economy. So that's a kind of effort to make a balanced point between economic security issue and the global trade promotions like that. We need to make a tangible action. And we gave this interim report to promote DFFT. DFFT is a kind of a concept from Japan. We give this proposal in G20 Osaka discussion. And but on the other hand, so far, we have not yet gave a clear, tangible action how to realize the DFFT. But this interim report and the data management framework is one of the tools to realize the data free flow with trust concept. And now we are talking with OECD team to make some kind of gap analysis among countries, OECD members countries, with data management framework. If we will be able to clarify what kind of gap we have among like-minded countries to data transformation, we will be able to find some kind of tangible solution, how to overcome such a kind of gap for data transformation. If we will be able to make such a kind of system, we will be able to promote the data flow among like-minded countries. And we would like to expand such a kind of system to other countries outside OECD. Such a kind of approach we are thinking now. And of course, we are very pleased that the U.S. government and the U.S. industry are changing its position about the data transformation. It's mean, frankly speaking, so several years ago, the U.S. industry heavily worried about some kind of protection will come for data transformation, data flow. But on the other hand, unfortunately, European friends introduced a GDPR, and China and Russia, even India, and some ASEAN countries has already introduced a strict data localization rules. We needed to overcome such a kind of situation. We needed to introduce some tangible tool to promote a reconciliation between such a kind of data localization or such a kind of community requirement for data management and data flow for economic promotion. So we hope, we believe that this is the one of the way to find a balanced situation between those programs. And we have just started this kind of activities. We would like to keep the close relationship with American friends to promote this kind of activity. Fortunately, next year, Japan is a chair of G7 summit. That we would like to give some kind of proposal to promote DFFT in G7 Japan in 2023. Yeah, thank you very much.
Dave Farber, I'll point everybody to Rikako's additional comment in the chat responding to Kazuo's question. But Toshi, thank you very much. That was a deep, discussion. And now we're going to get yet another perspective. Dave has been my close partner in this dialogue since we started it. And, a very well-known technologist in this area, distinguished professor at Keio University and co-director of the Cyber Civilization Research Center there, as well as a career professor of computer science and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. There's a lot in his bio. I'll highlight that he's also taught at the University of Pennsylvania, and he's been the chief technologist at the U.S. Federal Communications Commission. And to the point of he's going to bring a very practical technologist perspective of this. He's on the advisory boards of the Center of Democracy and Technology and EPIC, and a fellow at the ACM and IEEE. So I could go on for a while, Dave, but I'll turn the stage over to you so you can talk.
Okay, thank you, Greg. I have some prepared remarks, but I'd like to make some comments up front about not so much the previous talks, but the general attitudes, especially in the area of security. We have created an environment which is extremely valuable. The arrival of the internet, the evolution of computer systems, the worldwide connectivity has been extremely valuable and has driven the economy and driven businesses. On the other hand, we built it on a very, very fragile environment. Almost every one of our components, our software, our hardware, our computing engines, our network protocols are all very, very fragile with respect to security issues. It's very difficult because, in fact, most of them reflect years and years of investment in software, investment in hardware, and it's proven to be extremely difficult to make them secure. Just raising a caution, there are many, many problems at the bottom that have to be attacked and solved before we can get the type of trust that we're all hoping for. Let me address, though, in my prepared remarks, I very seldom have prepared remarks, but I actually did it this time. First, I'd like to outline the world that we live in due to the evolution of the internet and computers. The internet is a worldwide data network that provides for industry, education, and most importantly, individuals access to a virtual world that lets them share thoughts, documents, data in a largely free and open manner. There is a vast number of publications that describe the history of the internet, so I will avoid repeating that. I would point out that it evolved largely absent the involvement of governments. Its technical control has been largely done by civil society as its governance. The internet is a critical part of the world's economy and social infrastructure. It is very much dependent on the ability of individuals and companies to communicate with each other in a transparent, geographically independent fashion. Businesses and individuals routinely interact with each other, usually without a knowledge of where they physically are. For example, I may be communicating via messaging with a colleague who is on travel situation. In the internet world, I don't have to know where they are, whether they're in the same building, the same country, or halfway around the world. There are no telephone area codes or country codes, just the person's name in the software system I'm using. I may be sending that person a document as if I was handing it to them in person. I, for example, have many colleagues that I do not know where their permanent home is. In fact, many of my colleagues, I don't even know what they really look like, unfortunately or fortunately. It's more or less where they are at the current time. In our current world, outside of the temporary COVID situation, people are mobile. They may be in Germany one day, in Tokyo the next day, and New York the day after. The internet and the applications that are built upon it to see has removed the impact of the location on our personal and business communications. We send photos, documents, notes without having to worry about where we are and what number, and in very large number of cases, without worrying about physical space. The fact that I create a document when I'm in New York that I communicate to a colleague in San Francisco does not create any issues when I move to Europe, either temporarily or permanently. In the commercial world of the internet, in aiding the carrying on of business in the international arena, companies are more and more geographically distributed and count on the internet to tie them together, the operations of the business, from personal management to supply chain control. This often involves communication between offices in different nations, and in essence counts on the geographically distributed databases that are often replicated in part and must be kept consistent and optimized in order to operate businesses in an efficient economic fashion. Let me focus on a particular example. As many of you know, our social networking businesses are large and very powerful and form of basically a critical part, sometimes not welcome part, of our worldwide civilization. So I'd like to use them as a particular example, but there are many, many that are similar. They're worldwide internet-based systems that services vast numbers of companies and individuals. I'd like to examine the software architecture that allows Facebook and other social network companies to efficiently operate on a scale demanded for their users. I base my concerns about the architecture, comments about the architecture of the systems on both technical papers and my long involvement in large distributed databases. All such systems have similar structure since the organization of software architecture is driven by issues such as rapid response to queries, efficient use of communications, facilities, and security, including the protection of user data and interactions. In large physical distributed data systems, such as in the computer architecture of all modern computers, it's necessary to bring data from far away to the point of query of that data. Often when a user accesses, for example, data about a business's goods, the underlying system assumes that the user will probably want to make multiple accesses to that information about the goods. It is essential in order to provide the user with acceptable latency of operations to move that data close to the user. Not to do so would often make such systems unusable for the users because of the latency involved and the cost of communication. This often means that parts of data will be duplicated in multiple geographic places, which of course causes all the problems of consistency, et cetera, which have been largely solved, but are still a technical problem. The systems users push heavily in the creation of their systems and have done so for decades, increasing sophistication. Some data references to that data is spread widely geographically as the basic architecture of the software. Attempts to organize and restrict such data to specific regions would seriously degrade the performance of such systems if access to that data is allowed from outside of the region. And note that most of the times we do access data worldwide as if it was sitting next to us. Worse yet, changing the software so it can operate in this restricted fashion that's demanded by many regionalization proposals would entail a major rewrite of the core of such systems. It would likely cause a serious user level degrading of their interactions. Such a rewrite would also restart the instability of new implementations with respect to not only performance, but most likely stability and security. The major investment of software talent that has been used to create these stable internet and trusted environments would be lost. Recently, there have been attempts to restrict access to data within national boundaries. They have in the main been done by nations that are attempting to restrict access to the citizens of data and ideas that exist outside the region, and to restrict the ability of the world outside of their region to gain access to what is happening in their region. In the main, these have not succeeded since there are ways of bypassing, perhaps illegally, such restrictions that are built into the architecture of the technology. This has weakened the ability of their citizens and business to operate efficiently in a worldwide trade of information and often restricts information that is essential to progress, especially in science and health fields. I'd like to make some sort of final comments on sort of the environment that we have attacked these issues of trust and security in. They often start on very large, high-level concepts, which are very, very valuable. But there seems to be a disconnect between the development of technology on the bottom, which has been extremely active and extremely good, and the requirements coming down from the top. And so many of the technical applications and ideas that have been developed have not found ways to be made applicable. For instance, this is largely has shown itself in the past over the increases in stability and security of our underlying computer hardware. There have been many, many attempts to supply much more secure computer environments, hardware environments, which have largely been not used for a whole set of reasons. Some dealing with the cost of change, some dealing with the difficulties of adapting software, and some the difficulties of changing organizational structure. In our software systems, we've built increasingly more powerful and complex software, to the point now where, and for those of you who deal with actually making your computers run, you notice that the arrival rate of security patches to our software systems are now much more than the arrival of improvements to the software systems. Every time we make a fix, something else breaks. And that's been going on, and that's not a new phenomenon. It's certainly, when I started in this business in the 50s, that was a standard problem back then. It's now even a more complex problem. So what I'm aiming at is that the attempts to build systems that are trustable and secure in both the personnel part of the internet business as well as the manufacturing and business parts of it are going to have to pay attention to building a more stable environment and a more secure environment underpinning them. I could go on for hours talking about that, but I won't. I hope I have at least stimulated some arguments, maybe some ideas. Craig, over to you.